Hello YouTubers, this is your friendly neighborhood Theophage.
When we argue about things here on YouTube, we all believe that we're using good reasoning and logic to support our points. Logically, we can't all be using good reasoning and valid logic, since we often end up with completely contradictory and mutually exclusive conclusions. At least some of us, if not all of us, are necessarily wrong. But there's a problem I often see, and I'm making this video to address it. Though logic is a form of reasoning, bad logic is not always bad reasoning. In fact, sometimes what is an obvious logical fallacy is, strangely enough, good and justified reasoning. First, let's talk a bit about logic, specifically deductive logic. This is what most people are familiar with when they hear the term logic. Syllogisms, premises, and conclusions, if P then Q, so forth. What makes deductive logic so important is that given a logically valid structure, and given some true premises, we can move to a necessarily true conclusion. If the argument is valid and the premises are true, the conclusion absolutely has to be true. Now, it is good to be able to have this kind of confidence in the truth of various conclusions, but this confidence comes at a price. The rules of deductive logic are strict, and the things we want to be able to reason this way aren't always applicable to deduction. Deductive logic cannot tell us what is most likely to be true, for example, or what is probably true. The classical deductive syllogism moves from known general principles to specific instances, but cannot be used to move from specific instances to general principles. In short, deduction is great if you can use it, but for a great many things we can't really use it. Inductive logic is different. Induction does move from specific instances to general properties. Induction does allow us to reason what is most likely or probably true given certain conditions. Science is a mostly inductive enterprise, and I think we can all agree that science is very, very useful. But the problem with inductive reasoning is that we must trade this greater applicability and usefulness for less confidence in our conclusions. In an inductive argument, the form of the argument is always invalid. Even if the premises of such an argument are true and the reasoning behind it is all good, the conclusion may still be false. And that's the key, may still be false. I'm sure you've heard plenty of people here on YouTube call other people out for using logical fallacies. That's a fallacy, they'll proclaim. That's just an appeal to authority, or an appeal to consequences, or red herring, or straw man, or please God kill me if I hear this one again. That's just a bunch of ad hominem. You see, while it is true that all of these things which I mentioned are logical fallacies, just because something is a logical fallacy does not mean that it isn't good reasoning. It all depends on how these things are being used. Let's consider an example. If someone came to you and complained of some strange medical symptoms, and told you that they were taking advice about them from their neighbor, who's a certified plumber, how many of you would go, "Dude, don't go to a plumber. You should go see a doctor about that stuff"? I know I would. But suppose that person came back to you and said, "That's just an argument from authority. You're using logical fallacies." Would they be right? Technically they would. It is a logical fallacy to argue that just because someone is a plumber, that their medical advice is therefore false. And it is also a logical fallacy to argue that just because someone is a doctor, that their medical advice is therefore true. Why is that? Because if we look at it deductively, even if someone is a doctor and has specific medical training, they can still give advice that is wrong. And even if someone has not had specific medical training, they can still give medical advice that is right. It is possible. Remember, the conclusion of a valid deductive argument must be true, given true premises. If the conclusion simply may be true, even if it means that it's very likely or most probably true, it is still invalid deductively. Fallacies are fallacies, not because they are inherently bad, but because they make it possible for the conclusion to not be necessarily true. If the reasoning allows the conclusions to not be true, even given true premises, the reasoning is invalid deductively. But I think we would all agree that it's good reasoning to tell the guy to go to a doctor. Hell, he should go to 10 doctors if he is suspicious about any one of them. But it is still much, much more likely that a trained doctor will be able to properly diagnose and treat the guy than a trained plumber will. Good reasoning may be invalid deductively, but still be good reasoning. It may still lead us to discover what is more probably true than the alternative. But not only that, we also have to think about applicability. In the example about giving advice to someone to go see a doctor, we aren't really making the argument that the guy accuses us of making. Saying, "You should see a doctor, not your neighbor the plumber," isn't making the deductive argument, "Plumbers are not trained in medicine, therefore their advice must be false, blah, 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 blah." If you're not making a deductive argument, then you certainly can't be making a bad deductive argument, right? And yet, this is what people here on YouTube and elsewhere seem to be saying when they endlessly point out the logical fallacies of others. I'm not saying that it's always wrong to do so. Some people really do make these logical fallacies in their deductive arguments, and they really are using poor reasoning as a result. And of course, this needs to be pointed out to them. But it isn't always the case that that's what they're doing. Especially when I hear dumb stuff like, "Oh, that's just an ad hominem because somebody called somebody stupid or ignorant." All I can think of is, damn, that comment is stupid and ignorant. People, if someone you're commenting on isn't specifically making a deductive argument, then pointing out that their reasoning is deductively invalid is just meaningless. Consider that just about all of science is deductively invalid, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't lead to justified knowledge or use good reasoning. If the people are using bad reasoning, then point out how their reasoning is bad. All bad reasoning isn't an easily referenced logical fallacy, and all logical fallacies are not necessarily bad reasoning. And if you're going to cry, "ad hominem," my advice to you is don't, because you're most probably using that wrong. Let me see if I can explain. If someone calls you a retard or a loony or a slimy creationist or close-minded or whatever, that isn't an ad hominem fallacy. That's just an insult. Insults are not fallacious arguments. Or even if they're saying that you're a retard or a loony or a slimy creationist or close-minded or whatever, and therefore your conclusions are false, it still doesn't necessarily mean that they're using a deductive argument to determine that this is false, and therefore a deductive argument which is invalid due to ad hominem appeal. The inductive argument, X is a known liar and con man, Y is one of the things that is part of his con and which he claims is true, therefore it's reasonable to believe that Y isn't true, is still a good inductive argument using good reasoning, even though by definition all inductive arguments are logically invalid. Because remember, even saying that this person is a scientist and that this is their field of study, or that so-and-so is an expert in whatever the conclusion the debate is about, is still an argument from authority or an ad hominem. The phrase ad hominem simply means to the man, and it can be something good or something bad about them. In a purely deductive argument, the qualifications of the man don't matter. It's what the argument is about that matters. But in good reasoning, it can matter, even if it doesn't always matter. In good reasoning, it makes sense to listen to experts even though they could be wrong and what they're saying could be false. But it's still good reasoning because they are experts. So next time, fellow YouTubers, even if you suspect that your opponent is using bad reasoning, don't just mindlessly shout the names of some logical fallacies and think that you've debunked their argument. Actually point out their bad reasoning. Not everyone is arguing using pure deduction, so fallacies, as they're listed in lists, may not even apply, but good reasoning should always apply. Please feel free to rate this video, add it to your favorites, or just post a comment. I don't like trying to get into substantial discussions in the comment section, however, so if that's what you're looking for, please send me a message through YouTube's private message system, or email me at theophage@geocities.com. I'm also on Skype as Theophage1968. Yes, I'm that old. This is your friendly neighborhood Theophage reminding you, don't just swallow it whole. Make sure you chew it up first.